Chapter 21. All fucked up. Garrett arrived at Dalton's place to find the kid shirtless in the barn. He was working a homemade punch bag he'd made out of a bit of 2x4 and some sort of padding. Dalton was coated in sweat and looked like he'd been at it for some time. It made Garrett's knuckles sore just watching. He headed in and stood watching for a minute longer, trying to decide what to say. "Hello, amigo," he said after a while, taking off his shades in the dark barn. Dalton didn't respond. He was throwing punches and kicks at the padding and wood, but his eyes weren't seeing his target. Instead, they were distant, visualizing something else as the focus of his rage, and Garrett had a feeling he knew what, or who, that was. "You're all fucked up, aren't you?" he asked the kid. Again, no response. Garrett didn't like seeing him like this, and he knew there was an easy solution to the problem of Jasper. It was getting the hell out of Jasper. He saw that Dalton had reversed his fancy Mercedes out of the barn to create space for his workout. Garrett pointed at it now. "Let's crank that thing up and head down the road," he suggested. What did he expect? That the kid would say, "Sure, let's go, let me just grab a shirt"? No, but his heart wished he would. "We can be gone by dawn, never see this place again." Dalton stopped for a breath. "You can leave any time you want to," he panted, frustration clear in his voice. That hurt. "Oh shit, kid." Garrett started, but Dalton had already moved over to a rope that he'd hung up to the barn's roof. He was shimmying up it now using only his arms, trying to work out the pain of his mind by hurting his body. If it had been anyone else, Garrett thought to himself, he probably would have left there and then. Hell, he probably would have left long before this, or not even come to Jasper in the first place. But it wasn't anyone else. It was the kid. "Yeah, fuck," he reminded himself, and found a nearby ladder up to the top floor of the barn, his knee hurting with every rung he climbed. Up on the second floor, in a loft surrounded by hay bales, Dalton had another bag. This one was a canvas affair, stuffed with something heavy, maybe sand. Garrett took a few minutes before speaking, trying to reason out the best thing to say. But then he remembered that reasoning was Dalton's strong suit, not his. He always just got by on speaking his mind. "You don't need this," he told his young friend, and he meant it too. Garrett knew he'd been the best in the business, once. But that was a long time and a lot of unhealed injuries ago, no matter what the kid told everyone who would listen. Now, Dalton was the best, and he could be making the same money he was getting paid at the Double Deuce, or even more, in any one of 100 different clubs across the country. And all of them would be away from Jasper and Brad Wesley. "Don't tell me what I need," Dalton responded angrily, pausing between punches on the bag. "If you want to go, go. Get the fuck out of here and leave me alone." "Yeah, you're right," said Garrett with a sigh. "I ought to stop telling you what to do." He didn't listen worth a damn anyway. "But maybe I ought to kick your ass," he suggested instead. Dalton turned at that and threw a big, angry right hand. Malice in it, to be sure, but no real technique. Garrett caught it with his own hand, a couple of inches from his face. He stared Dalton in the eye over the top of their entwined fists and shook his head. "No, we don't want to do this." Dalton just stared back, panting, angry, all fucked up. "And I'll tell you something else," Garrett added. "You taught me as much as I ever taught you." Some of the anger seemed to drain from Dalton at that, and his tight fist slowly relaxed in Garrett's grip. "I love you, mijo," Garrett told the kid, his voice soft and full of pride. He hadn't said those 3 words much in his life, figuring they were overused and overrated. But he meant them now for this boy, and it broke his heart that he wasn't able to get through to him. "I'll see you," he said, letting go of Dalton's hand and heading for the way out of the barn. He hoped that the kid knew he'd be there for him when he was ready. Always. When one of the nurses had come to find Elizabeth and told her that some biker-looking guy was trying to find her, she'd known straight away that it would be Garrett. She met him in the lobby and took him down to the hospital's restaurant. She offered him a coffee, but he turned it down. They didn't sell beer. The pair of them had sat in silence for a while. He'd looked like it was paining him to be there, to speak to her. He'd seemed a different man to the charming, carefree one that she'd danced with. Something had been hurting him, and after they'd spoken she didn't know whether it was the referred pain he felt from Dalton, or the pain of asking for help. Something he didn't seem accustomed to doing. Maybe it was a combination of both. Eventually he'd opened up, somewhat at least, and asked her to speak with Dalton, since he was having no luck getting through to him. When she'd asked what she should tell Dalton, Garrett had struggled to answer, simply ending with, "Whatever works," before he left. Elizabeth got the feeling that, for Garrett, what that meant was telling Dalton to get as far away from Jasper, and her, as possible. She pulled up to Emmett's house and headed into the barn to look for Dalton. She found him by one of the windows, staring out across the darkness to Wesley's place. To Wesley himself. He was only wearing tracksuit bottoms, but he wasn't sweating. If he had been working out, he must have been finished for a while now. She wondered how long he'd been standing there like this, lost in thought. He didn't even turn as she came up the stairs. "Dalton," she called to him, and she saw his shoulders jump as he started from his daydream. "It's a little late for a house call, don't you think?" he said back over his shoulder when he recognized her voice. "I came to talk to you," she tried to tell him, but he interrupted her before she could add anything else. "No," he said, turning, a mixture of anger and hurt on his face. "You came to tell me to leave." Elizabeth wasn't sure if that was true or not. It had been all she'd thought about from Garrett's visit to the end of her shift and on the whole drive over here. What she wanted was for him to stay, with her. But what she wanted more was for him to be safe. "I care about you, Dalton," she tried. "You don't know him." "Bullshit!" he responded angrily, walking over to her. "I know exactly who Brad Wesley is. I have seen his kind many times. He keeps taking and taking until somebody takes him." Elizabeth knew all this anger wasn't for her, but it cut her all the same. She hadn't seen this side of him before. "It's obvious nobody in this town can stand up to him," Dalton went on, the condescension in his voice reminding her of Wesley himself. "But you can stop him?" she asked in a tone that said she thought it wasn't so. "Brad Wesley picked me," Dalton told her, pointing at his chest. "And when he did, he fucked up." She couldn't tell if his eyes looked crazy or committed as he stared at her and said, "I'm only good at one thing, Doc. I never lose." "But what are you going to win?" she said, half frustration and half pleading. "Who's this for anyway? Are you doing it for them?" she asked, meaning the townsfolk, Tillman, Red, Emmett and all the rest. That was the noble image that Dalton was presenting, the righteous anger of a shepherd defending his flock from a wolf. But that wasn't what she thought this was about. This was a personal challenge to his honor, his masculinity, his view of who he was as a modern-day warrior, and he had to meet it, or part of who he was would be taken from him. She could see she had the right of it from the look in his eyes. "I don't think so," she concluded, and started to leave, before realizing there was something else that needed to be said. "You think you're going to save these people from Brad Wesley?" She started angrily. "Well, who's going to save them from you?" As she delivered the last word, there was a massive explosion outside. It shook the barn all around them with its force. Dalton headed to the window and looked out to see Emmett's house in flames.